So, hey, community Bible study. I really got to find my remote for this thing so it doesn't look like I'm going in and out, right? So, all right. Last video for the week, okay, guys? And then I'll shoot some information on what we're going to be studying next week. But obviously, we are completing chapter 1 here. And next Sunday and all throughout the week, we will be discussing chapter 2 or the start of chapter 2, which is totally exciting to step on another stone and build off of what we've already been doing. So yesterday we were talking about kind of the phases of God or Paul's argument to lead up to his authority and on why he has the authority to preach the gospel in the way that he does. And I said there were 3 phases. The first phase was him as a persecutor, and we explained his past and what that looked like as a Pharisee and as when his name was Saul. And then we explained his conversion and became a believer. And that was phase 2 as the believer. And we really wrestled with this idea that God planned this all out from the beginning. And that's such a hard thing for us to grasp, because then you're looking at our lives and we're saying, God planned this? I mean, you look at my life, I'm scratching my head on the plan already, right? So we're wrestling around with that thought process. Some things I wanted to bring up on that in just a minute. But now on this next phase, we're going to be looking at Paul as the preacher, and we'll be looking at what that looks like through the verses on the next few verses that are laid out for us. But a couple key notes I wanted to kind of bring out. As Paul is the believer, and I believe this is something that impacts even all of us as we sit here and think about. So bear with me here a minute. One was God did it, plain and simple. I couldn't do it for myself. No human did it, and that's something that Paul is continually trying to refer to as he's writing to the Galatian people. It was God. God did it. There's no question, right? First of God did it by grace. And boy, he unleashed grace upon him. We're talking about a man who persecuted followers of Christ. And I look at my life, and man, God still pours grace on me daily. God has to put grace on me even at this moment, you know. And I had to go back and continually to seek his grace. God did it through Christ. He used Christ as a tool. Just like he tries to use each one of us as a tool. So he did this through Christ. God did it for the sake of others. Can you imagine that? So he allowed Christ to die on a cross for others. He allowed Paul to be converted for others. He allowed you and he allowed me to finally recognize who Christ is for others. Let that one sink in for a minute. Our life in Christ is for others. Kind of goes somewhere with that, couldn't we? Think about that for a little bit as we go throughout the next set of verses. That the life that God gave us is not ours, it's his, and he gave it to us for others. God did it for his glory. Goes back to why he created humanity in his image, right? I mean, it goes down to the purpose of why we are here. We're here for his glory. I do this videos and I teach these classes not for myself and not for my own gratitude, but I do it for his glory. I want to show who Christ is to the people that I work with here in the office, and I want to, and my hope is that you want to show who Christ is in the people in your offices and your workplace because of his glory, not ours. And it's all for him. And then it says God did it. God did it, guys. I know sometimes it's kind of a hard thing to wrestle with, and there's some of the things that I looked at, and with that first verse that we went over in verse 17, I believe it was. Verse 15, excuse me. But when he who had set me apart before I was born See, guys, God set us apart in the womb. Goes back to the whole sanctity of life, if you want, but God knew what we were going to be doing before we were even born. And so God did this. And it really is it's an amazing thing to really chew on. So in the final few moments, let's go ahead and look at Paul as a preacher. In verse 17 and following, it says, so he was revealed his son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles. Back in 16, excuse me. I did not immediately consult with anyone. So when Paul was converted, he darted off into the wilderness, and he wrestled with the gospel. And this is the time where he interacts with Jesus now. And he goes on and he says, nor did I go to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away to Arabia and returned again to Damascus. So he goes off, he goes to Arabia, and then he comes back to Damascus. And then after 3 years of being in Damascus, he goes to Jerusalem. Now, maybe it's just me, but there's a big impact on this, right? He goes back to Damascus where his conversion happens, and he's there for 3 years, and then he goes to Jerusalem, to the Jewish capital of the world, to where all the Pharisees, the head Pharisees are, to the lifestyle that he came out of. All those head Pharisees knew that he'd been converted over to a follower of Christ. What can you imagine could have happened then? So not only that, but he goes and he visits Cephas, also known as Peter, right? And remained with him for about 15 days. So he went over and hung out with Peter, right? What it doesn't tell you in this set of verses, what he doesn't write in this letter, is the fact that when he went to see Peter, it took him a little while to get in because Peter looked at him as Saul because of what he used to do. And so it was a lot of Paul talking to Peter even before he got in to tell him, no, this has really happened. I had an interaction with Christ, and now this is where I am, and I am now a follower of Christ, not a persecutor of Christ. And then once he did that, he went in and they hung out for about 15 days, is what it says on these verses, that Paul writes that he remained with him for 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles, it says in verse 19, except for James, the Lord's brother. And then in 20, he says, in what I am writing to you before God, I do not lie. 21 says, then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was still unknown in person to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They only were hearing it said, he who used to persecute is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. So he starts kind of laying more groundwork on where he went. And when we dive into chapter 2, it's going to be another step on top of this about his life and what he's going to. But he begins just laying the groundwork as a preacher. So what he's kind of alluding in these verses is that along with that, he was preaching the gospel. When he came back to Damascus, he was preaching the gospel. And it's very obvious when he says that people, in verse 23, that they were only hearing about him because they were saying he who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith in the faith that he actually once tried to destroy. And so they're starting to hear a lot of rumors about this Paul guy, and they already knew Saul. They knew him very well because they knew that if they heard Saul was coming, they had to flee. And so that was they began to really start wrestling with, oh my goodness, what an amazing concept, right? So a note that I have in here, I kind of re-emphasize the fact that he went to Arabia. And this is where he really devoted himself to prayer. This is the wilderness aspect of it, if you will. It was actually kind of more like going out to the desert. You can hear a lot of different references when people are trying to get close to God, or they're trying to, step out and find God. They're in the desert, right? Even when Jesus went to the wilderness, it was more considered a desert, more than likely. So you say he went to Arabia. He devoted himself to prayer, study, and meditation, which is where he had interaction and teaching with Jesus actually himself as well. And then he went back to Damascus, and he finally visited Jerusalem. The main purpose for this visit was to see Peter. However, as one could imagine, for several different reasons, it was rather difficult for him to get in to see him. So I can only really imagine just walking into town and the whispers or even the talking and maybe even the threats that could have happened as he walked into town. He then actually, what doesn't mention here, but he does return home after this to Tarsus. If you remember, Paul came from a town called Tarsus, and it was there, or it's here where he is said that he was recruited by Barnabas to begin work in Antioch, and he has a special place of Antioch for, as we mentioned, which is in the region of Galatia, because that was his first spot, right? That was the first trip he went on, was in Antioch. He went with Barnabas, and that was where he really began church planting, if you will. Well, I didn't realize I was running a little bit behind, but yeah, that's where we are right now. And I posed this question last week. If someone came to you with what he or she said was further revelation that is from God, not man, how would you determine the truth or falsity of that person's claim? So if someone said, I've got better revelation, I've got a new revelation that gives us closer to God, how would you determine whether or not that was true or not? And you know what? That happens. There's a lot of things out there. There's a lot of separate books, right? There's a book of Judah. There's a book of, just you name it. And there's a lot of different stories that are coming out, and people are saying, well, no, this is really it. This is really it. How would you determine? The disciples, Peter, had to determine whether or not Paul was telling the truth, that he actually was converted. How? How does he do that? Guys, in the comment below, let me know how you would do that. What are your thoughts? How do you determine that if somebody were to come up with some kind of new revelation, how would you determine that that was true? Guys, if you need to know Christ, if you want more, if you want to talk to me more about Christ and who he is, please feel free to shoot me an email. Other than that, I hope you guys enjoyed it. Sorry I went a little bit late, a little bit longer on this video. There's still a little bit more to unpack. But hit a like down there for me if you got it around. And like I said, give me a comment. Begging the question, how would you come about to a realization of truth? And when it comes to maybe someone saying, hey, this is something new that I learned. So guys, once again, thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful time, and I'm just praying for you guys. I love you guys. I don't think there'll be another video after this one until next week, next week's review, but I'll make sure I put in some notes as well. Okay, guys? Thank you. Take care.